My name is Michael Guyad, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Ilya Shapiro, who's got a lot of interesting things to say, given some of his most recent experiences, and obviously is very well versed when it comes to all things Supreme Court, which we'll also talk about. Ilya, for those who are not familiar with who you are, just talk about your background. How did you get interested in law? What have you done throughout your career? And what happened most recently that maybe put an unfortunate spotlight on you?
Sure. I am now at the Manhattan Institute, which is a think tank based in Manhattan, although I don't live there and have no plans to move there. I'm in Falls Church, Virginia. I'm the director of constitutional studies. I was hired to do con law, which I never really had a focus on. Manhattan Institute, or MI as it's known, has been around for about 45 years and does everything from policing to education reform, various kinds of urban policy, entrepreneurship, economic liberty, rule of law, those sorts of things. Before I joined MI, which was a couple of months ago, I'd spent nearly 15 years at the Cato Institute, ultimately becoming vice president and director of legal constitutional studies there. In between those two, earlier this year, I had an interesting, what people call lived experience when I tried to move to Georgetown University Law Center to become executive director of their Center for the Constitution. The joke is, well, we need this Center for the Constitution because the rest of the law school there is the Center against the Constitution. A few days before I joined the Georgetown faculty, I tweeted in criticizing President Biden's decision to limit his Supreme Court justice selection by race and sex. Right? He said he'd pick a black woman. And I said, that's not right. In my mind, I think this other judge, who happens to be an Indian American immigrant, would be the best choice. And so everybody else is less qualified, or as I phrased it in a way I would have preferred to phrase it differently, but I phrased it as we'll end up with a lesser, meaning less qualified black woman. And that set off a storm of manufactured outrage on Twitter, which boiled into the real world. I was suspended. I was put on paid leave my very first day on the job. And for 4 months, they so-called investigated whether my tweet violated some university policy. Ultimately, it took them 4 months to figure out on a technicality that I wasn't an employee. And so the various anti-discrimination harassment policies didn't apply to me in the first place. But they made clear that any future such utterance where someone claimed offense would subject me to further discipline, and so I could not work under those conditions. And so I very publicly resigned. 4-page resignation letter available online and detailed in the Wall Street Journal op-ed pages. And so now, in addition to my previous long experience filing briefs, being a media commentator, writing law review articles, lots of other things on all aspects of constitutional law, think about what's come before the Supreme Court in the last decade or more. I've been involved in all of that. But on top of that, I now have this lived experience with the First Amendment, with academic freedom and free speech. And so I'm capitalizing on both of those, as well as talking about my book, which just came out in paperback, Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations, and the Politics of America's Highest Court. So, Michael, that takes you back 15 years. Before that, I'll just sketch out. I was born in Russia. We immigrated to Canada when I was little. I grew up in a small town in Ontario, and then came to the U.S. for college and law school, and have been in the greater D.C. area for 18 years now.
Okay, so there's a lot I want to touch on. So I know you had publicly apologized in terms of the way that you had framed that tweet, and obviously that wasn't enough to calm the rhetoric and sort of vitriol pushback that you got. As you look back, this is more a question of self-reflection. What did you learn about yourself, the way you framed it, and is there anything that you would have done differently? Obviously, you wouldn't have framed it the way you framed it, with hindsight, given your own apology. But talk about that self-reflection for a moment.
Yeah, I've sort of started writing about all this stuff. I started a Substack approached me after I resigned. There's lots of interesting things that happen when you survive a cancellation or have your profile moved in this kind of direction. So my Substack, Shapiro's Gavel, there have been a number of posts, not exclusively about this experience, but every now and again I get reflective about these things. And so the first thing is, it's not a good practice to be doom scrolling, as they call it, going through Twitter and becoming upset at the crazy things that people say and whatnot. Late at night, I was on the road when this happened. If I were at home, it wouldn't have happened because I'd be, in bed reading or with my wife or something. But I was in a hotel room in Austin, Texas, and just got back from dinner and was getting up more and more upset about. This was the day that Justice Breyer's retirement was leaked, and so this was all being debated. So one thing I learned was certainly don't scroll through Twitter late at night when you're in a festive and a feisty mood and what have you. More broadly, I haven't backed away at all from the underlying point, which in a ABC News survey was supported by more than 3/4 of Americans, that you shouldn't limit your candidate selection pool by race and sex. But on Twitter encourages provocation and encourages snark. It encourages things like that. I would never phrase something like that in an op-ed or on the radio even, or anything like that. So the experience more broadly taught me how to deal with when a mob comes after you, and I learned who my friends really were. But in terms of the actual commentary, you really have to be careful in social media, at least if you're in a vulnerable position. And I was, in the sense that I was between jobs, or I was about to be between jobs, and I was moving to an institution, Georgetown, which of course is not very friendly to non-progressive voices.
So I agree with you on the point that Twitter obviously encourages provocation and certainly does not encourage context or nuance, right? And to your point about the doom scrolling, it is very easy to get in your own emotional reaction to other people's emotions, then in the copy of what you're trying to get across in the wording, have it misphrased while missing the broader point. I struggle with this even with my own tweets. I'm always myself reacting to people. I mean, I think that's natural to some extent, but also having to be careful, because we are in this environment where increasingly people simply react without having any context around not the way something is worded, but what's the underlying idea.
Well, and also in bad faith. I mean, we've part and parcel of the kind of the polarization and the toxicity surrounding all of our public discourse is that there's no grace, there's no understanding that people can, especially when you're doing things off the cuff, like you often are on Twitter, you can screw up and misphrase things that you might otherwise put differently, and also. People see their political enemies as not just wrong, but evil. And in that context, why would you tolerate the heresy from someone who deviates from your political religion? And in this case, there was the legal affairs reporter for Slate who has disagreed with me publicly on any number of things, but he manufactured this outrage and what's called snitch tagged Georgetown before I had a chance to delete the tweet when I woke up in the morning. That was the thing. I pushed send, tweeted this out, and I went to bed. And by the time I was woken up in the morning, it all exploded. So certainly a crucible. I called it 4 days of hell, followed by 4 months of purgatory. And since then, I don't know what the analogy kind of breaks down after that. But I've certainly learned that. You have to fight. You can't just roll over. My apologizing, saying I didn't apologize for the underlying message, and I think it's unreasonable and in bad faith to construe it as saying, as some did, that what I was saying was that no black woman is qualified to be on the Supreme Court. I think that's unreasonable to read it that way. But regardless, there's a lot of crisis management and strategery and all of this that goes into standing up for yourself and not bending the knee. And some urge never apologize for anything ever. I mean, it depends. If I had wanted to be a poster boy for cancel culture right away, that might have been the right way to go. But I was looking to stay in that job, and so I needed to navigate the point of saying, all right, my bad, I didn't phrase that correctly, but and I'm sorry. I can see that some people were offended by that, and I'm really sorry for that. But I'm not, let's move on. It was speech after all. I'm not harassing a particular person. I'm not. There's no evidence that in my life I've ever discriminated against somebody based on race or sex or anything else. And so the whole process, which again I'm writing more and more about on my Substack newsletter, has been eye opening, and it gives that practical experience on top of the defense of free speech and academic freedom, and pushing back on the illiberal, not liberal, but illiberal mob, both in academia and the broader world.
I think part of the nuance here is that there's two types of mistakes you can call it, right? One is the mistake in the communication and the way that something is framed or said. And you see that all the time with gotcha culture, and you see it with both parties too. Every time Biden does a gaffe, somebody makes fun of it. And, respectfully to both parties on that end, it ain't easy to be constantly out there communicating. Everyone's going to make mistakes. I make mistakes. You make mistakes. And we're also there's a human element to this stuff in that people get tired. They have other things going on, other variables that maybe cause them to mistakenly frame things a certain way, even though it's not the true intent. And then of course there's the mistake of the underlying idea that it's not formed properly or based on incorrect assumptions. This sounds to me as it's more of a communication issue. But having said that, how do you push back, other than by actively recommunicating, which also might have further mistakes down the line, the idea that there has to be nuance? Because unfortunately, as you know, more and more people are simply hearing a soundbite and responding. Twitter, unfortunately, to your point, encourages that, and you can never really get to any sort of proper place for proper discourse if everyone's just yelling at each other based on 280 characters.
Yeah, I mean, so when you're thrust into this kind of situation, first of all, it's important to get advice. Don't just trust yourself, even if you're a lawyer or a PR professional or Politico or whatever the case might be. You always need counsel, and I was fortunate to turn to friends, some people that just offered advice before I even had a chance to ask them on all of those different things, as well as in my context, because it happened in the academic context, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, the premier organization to defend the students and faculty that find themselves being persecuted for speech crimes and things like that. But goal setting is so important. So again, is your goal to just get publicity and monetize this experience? Is it to keep a job, to get a different job? Is it to minimize reputational harm? Is it, there's because the way that you strategize, the steps that you take, whether in the short term over the course of a scandal like this, or in the longer term, is different depending on the goal that you set for yourself. So for me, I had the audience of the dean. I had the audience of senior faculty at Georgetown. The Twitter mob I wasn't so concerned about. And I was silent on Twitter for over a month after this happened. It's only after, talking to counsel, it became clear that the investigation was a sham, and they were just waiting for the semester to end and the students to get off campus to make that decision and probably reinstate me with some kind of slap on the wrist, as essentially happened. That I decided, okay, I can get back on Twitter. I can get back in the media, not in terms of criticizing Georgetown or relitigating my cause, but in showing that I'm a professional in communications and con law and Supreme Court analysis, as the nomination at that point was playing itself out. But there are commonalities about instances of outrage mobs, cancel culture, and what have you, and there are differences. And it's different if you're a celebrity. It's different if you're someone like me who's not a celebrity but has access to platforms, the Wall Street Journal or Fox News, or friends who have acquaintances who have can amplify your message, or friends who can work behind the scenes and back channel, because there's the private side, the back channeling, and there's the public side. And then kind of ordinary people who get doxxed or boycotted, or in Canada, frozen out of their bank accounts for making politically incorrect donations. That's the real danger with all of this. And so the lesson for kind of the average person, even, it's nothing to do with how wealthy you are or what have you. It's access to platforms and pressure points depending on the situation. But you have to find out and figure out how to elevate your cause or join it with that of others, so that you can push back against these often amorphous but very toxic forces.
I'm curious if you've given thought to what the real definition of cancel culture is. And I say that because to me, it seems that cancel culture is just another way of saying counter to an extreme narrative, independent of political affiliation. All right, whether it's far left, far right, it's a very loud segment of a form of belief that if you disagree with it, you need to be shut down and basically in ways that could impact your financial livelihood, even the ability to get a job. Where does this stem from? I don't think it's as simple as saying this all started with social media, because there's always been a degree of, you can argue, cancel culture, but obviously not as pervasive, I think, as we have today.
Well, social media is the tool for it, and you couldn't organize that many people to go after another ordinary person without social media. You wouldn't learn about things. Things that people are upset about, would not make national news, or people wouldn't hear about them, but they get amplified on Twitter and elsewhere. Who knows what it'll look like, in 20 years? Because these days, only old people go on Facebook, and maybe in 20 years, only old people will be on Twitter, and it's all cancel culture is going to be through TikTok or whatever the next app might be. But I think you're right. I think it's a disproportionate response to a politically incorrect statement. I wouldn't say, some people are like, well, it's not. It's just facing the consequences of your actions. Well, that's not quite right. If someone harasses someone, or as an employer discriminates against them because of their race or sex, they've done something that is, and we can argue about what the response should be. But if you're just taking a politically incorrect position, should you indeed lose your job, your livelihood, all the rest of it, and it facilitates the formation of mobs to go after people like that, regardless of what expert judgment might be, or people in the field, or what have you. So it's a difficult situation, because we are at a place where, especially for living online, where you don't see that other person. It's not like you're a mob even acting physically face to face, but it's online with a name on a screen at best, and that strips the encounter of humanity and of grace and empathy and understanding and proportion.
And it's also important that I think the definition of what's politically correct is fluid. It does change generation from generation as well.
That's right, and it's not necessarily just a left wing thing. The left does have control over education, culture, technology, so it happens a lot more from that direction. But you see it, if some commentator or politician isn't sufficiently MAGA enough, they get called a rhino and they're canceled from things like that. Or even progressives or left-wing people who are perceived as not enough in that direction can happen that way too. So you're right. It's the Overton window, the range of permissible policy views, I think, has narrowed and skewed. And academia is probably the worst place for all of that.
All right, so let's go into that around academia. And again, I'm going to relate this to inflation in a bit, because I think this is all interconnected in some way, shape, or form. But there is this belief, which seems to be largely true from the evidence, that academia, to your point, is much more liberal. And you can make an argument that that's somewhat consistent throughout time, because I've seen studies that would suggest that the older you are, the more conservative you get. The younger you are, you tend to be more liberal. And if obviously you're teaching youth, there's sort of an element of that, I think, as well. There's even arguments around biological aspects as to why people will lean right or left based on literally brain composition. There's a lot of interesting things just that make us believe and think the way that we believe and think. But the discussion around education is interesting to me, in the sense that the whole point here is to express ideas. And expression of ideas obviously means things that you don't necessarily agree with. And if you get to a point now, which seems to be the case, where you can't freely express ideas in an educational setting. I've talked to all kinds of different thought leaders in the past who have expressed similar concerns, that it's actually quite harmful for the next generation, because they can't develop critical thinking if you're not giving them new things to think about.
I think that's right. In law schools, where I speak a fair bit, I'm a law school graduate nearly 20 years ago at this point. The faculties are doing a disservice to their students by for example, not teaching them how to interact with judges who, more or less, you're always going to have between 40 to 60% of the judiciary is going to be Republican or Democratic appointees, and they're not giving them the tools to address them. But even beyond the faculty, what's really changed in the last couple of decades isn't that the ideological ratio, whether college, law school, grad school, business school, it's not that the ideological composition has changed either among the faculty or the students, but that there's been a bureaucratic bloat, an expansion of the number of administrators, not professors. And a lot of that is in the DEI space, the diversity, equity, inclusion, which is kind of an Orwellian title because it really stands against intellectual diversity, prevents equal opportunity, and excludes those who don't hold to a fairly rigid orthodoxy. And so the administrators who rise, given that dynamic, the deans, the presidents, the department chairs, rise not by being bold, but by kind of keeping their head down and trying to avoid controversy. And so more than 20 or 30 or 50 years ago, they placate these minority radicals, or the radical minority rather, that is the illiberal mob. Again, not the decades-old complaint. I want to make this clear. Going back to Berkeley and Cornell and Columbia and all that in the 60s of the less liberal takeover of academia. This is something new. This is the illiberal takeover of academia because in almost all cases, those deans, presidents, etc., are not woke radicals. Instead, they're spineless cowards. And while they're very happy to imbue a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, they don't want to have that culture of free speech or the search for truth or civil discourse. These things are sort of at the heart of the classical academic mission. And that's why academia is suffering.
And you kind of alluded to where I wanted to go with that, which is that you said, what happens is people kind of keep their head down for fear of backlash. There's I'm reading this from a survey that basically says that more than 80% of college students said they've self-censored at least some of the time on campus, with 21% saying they self-censor often. Um, how do you think about this sort of trend towards self-censorship, which seems to unequivocally be in its own bull market? Because the dynamic of cancel culture is that it causes people who are not that willing to engage and push back on the crowd to simply keep it internally, which really creates a problem because then the only ones that speak are the extremists on both sides, while the middle is just staying quiet.
Yeah, and that trend line, I think there's a parallel. Not the self-censorship isn't quite as bad outside of campus life, but it's still there. Emily Eakins, my former colleague at the Cato Institute, who's the director of polling there, has done fascinating work showing that a lot of people just will not disclose to friends and neighbors what their political views are because of real social consequences and that kind of peer pressure and what have you. And that's it's even more of that among young people and on campuses. And that's definitely something that's different from, I don't think of myself as that old. I'm 45. So I graduated college just under 25 years ago. And, a lot of people weren't political, but I wouldn't say that people were self-censoring in class and things like that. And I don't know what in society caused it. Now, things like COVID, things like the killing of George Floyd, these accelerated, I think, these illiberal tendencies in various ways. We can go into that if you like. But it seems like whether it's the advent of social media, whether it's how people complain about the latest generation of kids going back to ancient Greece. But I think there's something in the culture and socialization these days that's different than it was, forgetting what people's actual politics are, but in terms of this self-censorship and the climate on campuses, that's definitely different and less healthy than it was in decades past.
I wonder, Ilya, if you think that dynamic has resulted in this environment where there is a lot of inflation, there's too much debt, because if we go with the idea that people are self-censoring because they're afraid of pushback from the quote-unquote mob, whether it's right or left, Well, then that means that whenever there's talk about stimulus or talk about some fiscal plan that's going to throw more dollars into some part of the economy, that those that push back against those actions are vilified because it's seen through a political lens, where their views on maybe not doing stimulus or maybe not doing a new Inflation Reduction Act, whatever you want to call it, if that creates sort of a level of increased leverage in the system. I'm trying to relate this issue of self censorship and debate and discourse in terms of conditions that result in extremists taking over also the purse strings of the government, essentially.
I think that's correct, only to the limited extent that you're talking about fiscal policy during the pandemic. So the way that dissenters from the government line about the pandemic, its causes, what to do about it, the nuanced discussion of whether masks work, how much vaccines work, all the various churn, whether to close schools, all of the roiling policy debates surrounding the pandemic, and then producing these mammoth spending bills when people are cooped up during lockdowns and there's less economic activity, and that has directly led to inflation. So to the extent that the crackdown on so-called misinformation about COVID, which largely ends up becoming true, that has contributed to the inflationary cycle. Short of that, I don't know if it's anything different than politics as usual, and certain kinds of politicians from one party want to spend on something, or another want to spend on something else. But we have lived this black swan event with the pandemic, where there's control of advocacy and that self censorship as well.
But it is interesting though, on that, because and that where you kind of took me to a place just in terms of the thinking about this, that if you view, let's use the masks as an example. If you were masks were used as justification, and the fear obviously around spreading COVID resulted in lockdowns and all that, the outcome of which was stimulus, tremendous spending, so on and so forth. You can also make the same argument around wars, where if you I mean, I remember very well in 2003, I believe it was, when we went into Iraq. I was in college and I was saying, as somebody who is Middle Eastern, this is not something we should be doing, aside from the fact that the U.S. doesn't quite understand the culture of the Middle East. It's going to result in tremendous spending. And I always go back to this point that inflation is a process, not an event. And I was shut down by some of my own colleagues when there was such fervor around going and getting Saddam Hussein. I say all that because I think the consequence of shutting down opposing opinions is always that you're not able to get to a place where there can be fiscal responsibility.
I haven't looked at it, so I can't really opine. I've seen this during the massive spending bills during COVID, but I'd have to think about it and read some analyses. Obviously, fiscal policy, I follow it, what's in the news, but that's not my professional area.
Yeah, like I said, it's more just sort of about the pushback. Again, if you don't have discourse around being actions that the government is taking, and if you're countering a popular narrative that is in the moment, my point is that the end result of not countering it is that the action gets taken by the government, and that results in more and more spending, which results in eventually high inflation. I think that's sort of the connection I'm trying to make there.
That's possible. I don't know if that's different now than it was like 10 years ago or something like that, whether it's just the normal political give and take, or whether because the demanding heights of culture and communications skew more left and therefore more inflationary, whether that has changed the dynamic.
So I had a guest on, Vincent Delouard, a couple weeks ago, and he made this point that trust is inversely correlated to inflation. And again, I'm going back to the inflation point for a moment because that's what we're all living in. And this point that trust is inversely correlated to inflation, I thought was interesting, in that his argument was that the less trust there is in a government, the more inflation you're going to have, right? That you have to have trust as a way of keeping inflation anchored. And to have trust in any government, you need to have a strong legal system, right? That's, I think, unequivocally true. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the evolution of trust in the legal system over the last decade or so, and if that has indeed eroded, what are the causes of that?
Societal trust is incredibly important. It's the rule of law, economic activity, all of those things go in better directions in higher trust societies. I think Francis Fukuyama wrote a book on trust that's very good. Not famous for the end of history and all that. This is a very different type of book, analyzing the importance of social capital and societal trust and things like this. And I think you're right. I think when people don't have long-term horizons because they can't trust that the rules of the game are going to be stable, they behave in different ways than when they can trust it. That affects savings rates, that affects consumption, that affects investment in someone's business. What kind of how you raise your kids. Absolutely, spending on non-productive uses on security as opposed to on things that can grow the economy and innovation and things like that. And in the law, I think we've seen the rise at the constitutional level when you're talking about national public law, increased pen and phone governance with presidents of both parties having their lawyers adopt really skewed readings of statutes, torturing them beyond recognition to adopt policies that don't go through Congress. So I think you're right. I think this idea of trust has ramifications across a host of areas, and certainly economics and fiscal policy is one of them.
And that, I think, is a good transition to your book, Supreme Disorder, because it's hard to have trust in the legal system if the legal system is increasingly politicized. So first, I want you to lay out, why did you want to write the book to begin with? Because as we know, it's quite an endeavor to do to start with. But what was the sort of core thesis behind the book? And is there anything that, as you look back since it's published, that you think has changed? Even though I know it hasn't been that long, but talk through that.
I wrote this book, started putting together the proposal in the wake of the Kavanaugh confirmations in the fall of 2018 it was. And I wanted to see, we've gotten to such a bad place where the Supreme Court is now dragged into the same toxic cloud that develops the rest of our public discourse. And I wanted to understand the role that politics has played in nominations, confirmations, Supreme Court actions more broadly. Because people talk about, before Kavanaugh, Clarence Thomas, Bush v. Gore affected people's thoughts on things. Robert Bork, a lot of people point to Robert Bork in 1987 as the original sin of the politicization of the process, but that's not really right. And as I found, the politics has always been part of the process, going back to George Washington, our very first president, who had a Chief Justice nominee rejected by the Senate for political reasons. What's different now is, and really I'd put the inflection point around 1968, which was obviously a pivotal year in American cultural history, political history, and legal history. Richard Nixon ran against the Warren Court. He talked about strict construction and law and order. LBJ tried to elevate Abe Fortas, the sitting justice, to become chief, and that was filibustered. A bipartisan filibuster, never even had a majority support. And it was really at that point that judicial philosophy, as opposed to politics qua politics, became the overriding consideration. And we can sort of trace tit for tat escalations since then. And now, of course, that's gone into the lower courts as well. And ultimately, what we have is a culmination of several trends where divergent interpretive theories map onto partisan preference at a time now when the parties are more ideologically sorted and polarized than they've been since at least the Civil War, if not earlier. So when you have one of these precious vacancies in a very powerful court, because that's another trend that over decades has accreted power to the court, then you go to battle stations and it's incredibly fraught, and there can be no compromise pick. It's an up or down zero sum game, and so that's where we are. And there are no easy solutions. We can talk about various reforms, whether term limits or court packing or more technocratic style reforms. These are addressing the symptoms, or tinkering, rearranging the deck chairs on Titanic, because the problem isn't the politicization of the process, but of the product. If you make the Supreme Court less important by pushing more power back to Congress rather than the executive and the courts, and to the states and localities rather than the federal government, that's the only way to ultimately diffuse these tensions. But that's not an easy solution. That's not a quick one either. So I think we're sort of stuck in our moment of every vacancy being very controversial.
I don't know how you resolve that, though, right? Because if the vacancy obviously happens under any particular administration, it has all kinds of longer term implications based on one's views. So, if you kind of alluded to some of the potential remedies, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, outline some of that, because I don't see how you can go back and make it so that it's not political when it comes to Supreme Court nominations. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, well, it's never been non-political, as I said. The only way to change things is to make the position less important. Decreasing the power of the court. If the court is going to be deciding half a dozen of the biggest issues in American politics every June, then we're gonna keep having these fights. But putting the ball more back in Congress's court, as it were, so that it's making a lot of these decisions rather than drawing up very broad statutes that then executive agencies, administrative agencies end up promulgating the regulations, the laws by which we live our lives. If that happens, well, then they get sued, and the Supreme Court ends up deciding the issue, and that's whether it's immigration or healthcare, a whole host of issues that have been decided there rather than in Congress over the last couple of decades. Short of besides unless you change that kind of dynamic, there's no way to kind of snap your fingers and force senators to be less political somehow. They're responding to the incentives that they pay.
Right, and that kind of all goes full circle then, right? Because if the only way to make it not political or not lower on the political side for the nominations is to make the Supreme Court less powerful or less influential, that goes back to less trust in the government, which results in more inflation.
I don't know how directly it causes inflation. There's definitely a dynamic to ratcheting up of government, but government has grown without necessarily the inflation that we're seeing now.
The legal dynamics as well as the economy, obviously. Okay, so let's go back to let's go back to extremism for a moment, which is always a fun topic. There is this. I had put out this tweet on Saturday or whenever Biden was speaking, and I tend to be much more independent. I believe that you vote the person, not the party. This is more of a side note. I just think that too many people vote by party than individual than leader. But I made this point that inflation is probably a bigger risk than any individual from any party, because inflation creates the conditions under which extremism persists, right? And I was really referring to the Weimar Republic there, which created the conditions for Hitler's rise to power. And obviously, you're not there in terms of the hyperinflation that the Weimar Republic had, and hopefully we never will be. But I always go back to conditions matter more than anything else, because conditions lead to unintended consequences. Is there any way that extremism gets less extreme? Because it seems that once you've gotten to this point where only the loudest get the most retweets and likes and get the most attention in the media, then again, I don't see how you can possibly have any sort of rational conversation to really fix the problems in the country and make the entire system more robust.
It seems like neither party is interested in having an enduring majority in terms of capturing the middle voters. They've all been going for turnout strategies. You yell and scream and you turn out your base and you try to win elections that way, which isn't very stable, because you marginally win one election, but then that small number of votes that put you over the top, they get tired and annoyed at the extremes that you're empowering, whether the woke left or the populist right, and they switch, and then they get tired of the next guy, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. A more longer lasting solution would be to put together a governing coalition. It's hard to imagine anybody putting together a Reagan-esque landslide these days. But you'd think that the parties want to work towards that rather than trying to eke out presidential elections with 10,000 votes here and there in a handful of swing states. But that's ultimately what would ratchet down the extremism if one or both parties started to play more for the middle to have an enduring majority.
And I agree with you. Just obviously, as it seems like an almost impossibility. I don't know. It just seems like we're very far away from a period where we can unify the country as opposed to just see everybody as red or blue.
Yes, I don't know what I can say to that.
Yeah. No, it's more just a stream of consciousness on my end. Let's go.
Sure. Thanks for that. My colleague at Manhattan Institute, Jim Copeland, focuses on ESG and business law and stuff like that. So he's really the right one to ask about that. We're still at the regulatory comment stage for a lot of these things. There will be lawsuits clearly over federal rules regarding ESG, and it does again, I'm a simple constitutional lawyer. I'm not a securities lawyer or anything like that, but it does seem like ESG standards are pretty arbitrary, and as different definitions of political correctness or politically correct investments change, then the ESG approved mix shifts as well. More broadly, I'm seeing a little bit of pushback or change in the corporate world with DeSantis' shot across the bow, Disney, the response of the corporate world to the Dobbs leak and the eventual decision. The Supreme Court abortion case was markedly different than other types of political shocks, shall we say, leading up to that. Netflix saying, if you're not comfortable with our programming, maybe you should work somewhere else. So it could be that the pendulum is starting to swing in the corporate world a little bit. And as far as regulators are concerned, that is going to end up in the court. It's not going to end up at the Supreme Court this term, but certainly the ESG rules are going to be litigated. And look, if a Republican wins in 2024, those rules are going to be rescinded. So that's not good either, that we have this yo-yoing of rule by regulation and executive action and things like that. That's certainly not a stable investor environment, to be sure. And I think if I say anything more on that kind of businessy regulatory subject, I'm going to be too far over my skis. As far as the coming Supreme Court term, I haven't focused again on the business cases that might be interesting, y'all. If one of you wants to hire me to give a presentation to whatever your industry area that you're working in, I've done those sorts of things before. I'll bone up on whatever, I like. There's not that many cases total, like on the docket, and only decide 70 a year. So it's not that hard for me to bone up on exactly where the decisions are going to be. There's a case called Accent Enterprise versus FTC. The Federal Trade Commission is in the news for other things, going after, I think it's Apple and Google on antitrust claims and certain other things. This is a case about a challenge to the FTC structures and procedures, the way that internal adjudication within the agency can't be challenged until you've kind of gone through the effective kangaroo court. And here, this is a challenge to the constitutionality of that structure altogether. And the Supreme Court is almost certainly going to say that you can bring those kinds of structural or administrative claims in federal district court without having to go through the internal agency process. SEC versus Cochran is the biggest securities case, and that's a similar challenge to SEC adjudications and their administrative law judges, their ALJs. The courts really enjoyed in the last decade these little kind of structural appointment clause, removal clause, internal agency adjudication sort of cases, and they're sort of requiring more democratic accountability and allowing challenges in federal courts rather than having to go through the administrative proceedings if you think that those proceedings are illegitimate in some way. I think those are the biggest business cases, unless you expand the definition of a business case to include like the affirmative action case, the biggest case of the term, challenging both Harvard and UNC and their use of race in admissions. I think if this past term indicated that a lot of the greatest hits from the 70s are under attack, not the Warren Court, which was the 50s and 60s, but the Berger Court, which sort of, I think, was showed some excesses in various ways. Well, our modern affirmative action regime, with the use of diversity as a compelling interest for racial discrimination or racial preferences, that's from 1979, the Bakke case, and that, I think, more likely than not, will be overturned, which may have ramifications atmospherically beyond the higher education world. Well, there's a lot there. I'm not sure that mandatory voting is constitutional. I think it would take a constitutional amendment. Whether it's a good idea to do, you see in a lot of those countries, people do spoil their ballots on purpose or vote none of the above. That would require a different change to be able to vote none of the above. I guess now you can just submit your ballot without checking anyone off, but those aren't tabulated in any way. It's unclear that higher voting rates in general produce better policy, whatever your definition of better policy is. And indeed, in many places, higher voter turnout can be a symbol of, can be a symptom of there's something being seriously wrong with governance, because people are really, really unhappy. If everyone's, kind of hunky-dory, they don't have to worry about what's coming from their federal or state capital, they're less inclined to vote because, they don't need to do anything and so forth. My friend and professional colleague, Ilya Shapiro, has done a lot of work on voter ignorance. Sometimes it's rational to be ignorant. Why bone up on complicated policy decisions when you still only have one vote? Things like that. So I don't think that just having more people vote, whether by having fines for not showing up at the polls or whatever other mechanism, I'm not sure that just increasing the voter turnout is any sort of panacea, let alone would create a marginal improvement in public policy.
Yeah, although I think that it's interesting thought experiment again, because if you had everybody being required to vote, then self-censorship really doesn't matter, because no matter what, whether you express or communicate your belief about the existing system publicly, it'll be reflected in the actual vote itself. And the idea that maybe matters, I think, is important.
Part of the trick with elections isn't just having free and fair elections, but having them seen as free and fair. That is, voter confidence in the integrity of elections is just as important as the actual integrity of the election, because going back to that trust issue, people want to trust that if they lose, or if the candidate they vote for loses, that it was a fair process. It wasn't rigged. It wasn't stolen in some ways. Obviously, we're living through a period now where both on the left and the right, again, low level of trust, and that has been extended to faith in elections. Now, whether blockchain can be a solution to that, I don't know. I myself, even though I've listened to many, many explanations of how blockchain works and how cryptocurrencies work and stuff like that, I don't know if I could, give you an explanation of exactly how it all works. So it'll be very hard to explain to people what that would mean, and therefore it's unclear whether that would increase confidence at all, rather than make people think that it's some shadowy thing that they can't really understand, and it's whatever. So in terms of actually making the elections work more efficiently, maybe that may well be the case, but whether it can be perceived that way and increase confidence in the integrity of the election, and therefore the legitimacy of the governance it produces, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I think the real takeaway, and I think was a great question, Alpha, because I think the real takeaway is it really all does boil down to trust in the judicial system, on the legislative side, and again, I go back to the extent that cancel culture prevents a degree of communication and discussion, and then as a result, lack of trust, all that creates more inflation and a more difficult environment ahead. So I know I'm relating a lot of different topics there, but I do think that they all do intersect in some way, shape, or form. Anyway, everybody that's here again, I appreciate those that joined. Special thanks to Ilya for spending the hour here. Any final thoughts, Ilya? I know obviously those that are interested should obviously check out Supreme Disorder. But any final words here before we wrap up?
Yeah, Supreme Disorder available in lots of different formats, including even like CDs and Audible and Kindle and all that, as well as my Substack, Shapiro's Gavel. Look, you've piqued my interest. I mean, I will now be more cognizant of articles as I come across, my feed in various ways about the relationship between social trust and its impact on the rule of law, on inflation and investment concerns and things like that, because that's, it's one of my former Cato colleagues, Dan Mitchell, had this Mitchell's golden rule. The government might be growing, it might be bad fiscal policy, what have you, but as long as the economy grows faster than the government, we should end up okay. And I think we've been inverted there for more than a decade or so. But it's definitely something to keep track of.
Well said. Everybody here, thank you for joining, and I'll have another space tomorrow. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Cheers.